can't find the exact moment in time where hippie culture was invented or who the first hippies were. There is no origin story or founders of the hippie culture movement. As far as I can tell, hippie lifestyle and hippie culture evolved from young people's need to find a place for themselves in the new world. They were part of a modern, progressive generation born into a primitive world that was advancing technologically at an astounding rate, run by old people with outdated ideologies and beliefs. At the time, they didn't know what they were searching for. All they knew was that they did not believe in the accepted narrative and that they did not like where society was going. They were against the expanding consumer culture and were in favor of a more holistic approach to life, more in tune with Mother Nature. Some of the more widespread beliefs of the hippies were that commercialism, materialism and industrialism were leading to the destruction of the natural world. In fact, it was hippie movement that led to the Environmental Protection Initiative gaining widespread acceptance by the general public. Which is where the term flower children come from. They were also often called tree huggers. The term hippie was derived from hipster, which was slang for someone considered cool in the mid-60s. By 1964, fashion sense started to drift towards the hippie look, but upon closer inspection, in my opinion, the designs seemed to inspired by Native American culture. In 1965, LSD use exploded among young people. You can see its effects influencing the designs and fashion of young people, and by 1966 psychedelic designs can be spotted everywhere, and in 1967 the first mention of hippies starts to appear in various news media of the time, and it was actually used as a pejorative, as in, "you dirty hippies." Many adopted a vegetarian lifestyle and they made their own clothing. The psychedelic clothing from the late 1960s were made by hippies themselves, which was then later copied by commercial and fashion industries. They also practiced what was known as a free love. Many males grew beards, and both men and women wore sandals and beads. Women wore long flowing so-called granny dresses, and rimless granny glasses were popular with both men and women. There were actually a number of counterculture movements during the time. But to be a hippie, they didn't have a strict membership procedure like, for instance, you can't be part of a motorcycle gang without the bike, the leather, the attitude, biker boots and so on. Hippies didn't actively try to distance themselves from anyone who wanted to take part in hippie culture. They didn't discriminate or call anyone a fake hippie. Not once have I ever come across a case of hippie exclusion. With most subcultures of the time, except for maybe the misfits, you had to make an effort. To name a few, there were jocks, nerds, rock and rollers, skateboarder, roller skaters, greasers, cowboys, surfers, and later we had goth, hacker, gamers, rasta, steampunk, lolita and skinheads. I just found out that there were skinheads that weren't racists. Hippies embraced everyone and welcomed all. Their goal was to spread love and peace to everyone. No one was ever bullied for not being hippie enough, although there were levels. You could be a casual hippie, have a job or go to school and wear flower pattern dresses and bright hippie colors and have a love for hippie culture. The flower child. Then there were those who left their homes and got more into the drug and free love aspects of hippie culture. Then there were those deep into the lifestyle. They chose to completely drop out of consumer culture and modern living. Many created hippie communes, practiced vegetarianism, free love, they never shaved or sometimes never bathed. A lot of them even chose to live completely cash-free by growing their own food. Now, in order to understand the movement, we need to get into the mindset of the average American of the time. Although the hippie movement was not directly involved in political protests, it was influenced by the broader social and political climate of the time. The anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and the women's liberation movement all had an impact on the development of hippie culture. We last left off in the late 50s with the Beats, so we'll continue from there. When Elvis Presley's career was at its peak, he had teenagers, and specifically teenage girls, going mental at his live shows. These days girls screaming at a concert is not unusual, but back in 1956 and 1957 no one had ever seen anything like it, and this confused the adults of the time, and many of the grown-ups were actually so scared that they wanted Elvis to be thrown in jail. When teenage girls watched Elvis dancing, that was when the screaming started. The older generation saw this as unnatural and called Elvis a sexual pervert. Psychologists feared that teenage girls and boys could easily be, quote, aroused to sexual indulgence and perversion by certain types of dance moves and hysteria. Analysts even go as far as to say that Elvis Presley brought sex to the minds of teenage girls in the 50s. Before the 50s, teenagers didn't have famous musicians that they idealized like we have these days. And although records were available long before then, they were very brittle and would break easily because they were made of clay, cotton and shellac, a resin secreted by insects. Also, the records were very expensive, so they were mostly made for adults. A quick history of plastics here. It won't take long, I promise. Plastic was invented in 1907, but like any technology, it was slow to be adopted on a wide scale. It was mostly used for manufacturing cars and airplanes up until World War II, when shortages developed for things like tents, parachutes, warm clothing. Women gave up various luxury items and even donated things like woolen stockings to make parachutes and uniforms for the war. Kitchens this time had only steel, for example, like those old-timey biscuit tins Grandma used to have. Women were used to those and didn't want to change them for plastic at first, but in 1948 Tupperware hit the market and the plastic industry slowly took off, replacing many things around the house with plastic. So when PVC was first used to make records in 1948, music became cheaper over time. Plastic records lasted longer and didn't break as easily, so kids and teenagers had more access to them. So the timing was perfect for rock and roll artists like Elvis, since it was music for a younger generation. Teens would see artists perform live on television and could buy the records in stores. Back then, everything on TV had to be performed live. Color TV was invented in 1953, but it would take another 10 years for it to be mass-produced for the public. Color film was already in use in cinema but was too expensive for common people. The war also normalized the idea of women working, so cash flow wasn't as tightly controlled by the man of the house anymore. Teenagers, both male and female, could now get jobs at places like drive-through fast food restaurants called diners. McDonald's was already 10 years old in 1950. A hamburger cost 15 cents and a milkshake 20 cents. So they were the popular hangout spot for teenagers, and you could play a song on the jukebox for 10 cents. So if you wanted to be cool, daddy-o, you would play a song for everyone to listen to, and girls would thank you if you played their favorite song. Meanwhile, the college kids would indulge in books and poetry published by the Beats, who also released a few records. The core message of beat culture was rejecting the traditions and values of the previous generation, or what they called being a square. Instead, they sought out a meaning to life, with a deep exploration of Eastern religion and philosophy. William Clifford Brown, who went by the name Big Brown, was an African-American street poet, performer, and recording artist, and a prominent member of the Beats during the 1950s in New York. It was his poetry that would start the evolution to rap and hip-hop. Now, before we get to the 60s, I didn't know exactly how to bring in the story of the Owsley Stanley, also called Bear. That's because his story and influence is so constant and overbearing to the story. Like Albert Hofmann before him, his influence on 60s counterculture cannot be overstated. Without him the 60s would probably not have been the 60s, and his contribution to the story spans all the way from late 50s all through the 1960s. There's no way I could do it proper justice, so I'll give you this quote from Robert Greenfield, who wrote a book about him.
The insane genius of this human being was that he was like a rebel without a cause. He never fit and was a complete outsider. He was brilliant at everything. He'd been in the Air Force. He worked as a rocket engineer. At the same time, he was really kind of a lost soul, and didn't have a place to find himself. Then somebody gave him a half a dose of pure Sandoz acid. Remember Sandoz from the beginning? Yeah, that one, and it was beyond anything he'd ever taken before. At the time, he was taking classes at the University of California, Berkeley, and after his LSD experience, he went to the Bancroft Library and spent a couple weeks reading all the existing literature on LSD. Then he began to manufacture acid, synthesizing the purest LSD to ever hit the street. Albert Hofmann, who first synthesized LSD in 1938 and took the first intentional acid trip in history, supposedly once said Owsley was the only one who ever got the crystallization process right. It is incredibly difficult to make LSD. It's not like Walter White cooking meth. It's a very, very difficult chemical process, and Owsley was so obsessive that the glassware he used when he made the acid was designed especially for him. The acid he created was so powerful, clean, and pure that he became the supplier to Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. IIT was Bear's acid that helped create what was going on at all these iconic countercultural events. When Bear heard the Grateful Dead perform for the first time in 1966, he knew they were going to be bigger than the Beatles. He became their sound guy, their benefactor, and he paid to take them to Los Angeles to be a part of Kesey's acid tests. Most of the people who were at the Human Being concert were tripping on a brand new batch of acid he created called White Lightning. The first batch he ever created consisted of 800,000 doses, an extraordinary amount. At the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival, there was another new batch he created called Monterey Purple. He gave his acid to Pete Townsend of The who had taken LSD before, but nothing like what Bear gave him. Townsend said the stuff was so powerful that he didn't take acid again for 18 years. John Lennon also sent a cameraman to Monterey with the express purpose of bringing back enough Owsley acid to last him a lifetime. Lennon was terrified he wasn't going to have enough acid for the rest of his life, and he only wanted to take Owsley's acid, which Bear gave him packed in a lens case. The Beatles then tripped for the next 3 weeks, and it led to the creation of the Magical Mystery Tour album and the movie. A couple nights later in San Francisco at Fillmore West, he gave Jimi Hendrix the acid, too. He was one of the guys who actually created the 60s. Without his LSD, I don't think those times would have been as crazy as they were, and that's why I decided to write the book.
The 60s. It's no coincidence that the 60s is well known for vibrant colors, psychedelic designs, neon-colored bin bags and trippy wallpaper. All a direct influence of psychedelic drugs which were still completely legal. The Beatles, who were associated with the Beatniks, started their musical careers in England, Liverpool in 1960. They are widely regarded as one of the most influential bands in the history of popular music. The Beatles' music and style had a significant impact on the hippie movement, and they were embraced by many young people as symbols of the counterculture. The Beatles' music was often associated with the use of psychedelic drugs, and their lyrics often contained references to drug use and LSD. In 1960, Professor Timothy Leary founded the Harvard Psilocybin Project with Professor Richard Alpert to explore the effects of psychotropic substances on the human mind. They gave magic mushrooms and LSD to volunteer subjects and recorded their real-time descriptions of the experience. Being a Harvard professor and actively encouraging the use of psychedelic substances to young people made the government nervous. Both would end up leaving Harvard by 1963, but still sharing the understanding and knowledge gained from his research throughout the 60s and 70s.
Named Timothy Leary.
Leary was a Harvard professor, and he was one of those people who got one of the little packages from Sandoz Laboratories with a supply of LSD in it. And Leary had this gigantic experience, and he began to proselytize for it. For instance, once he proclaimed that LSD released a huge amount of energy, 90% of which was sexual energy. He said, no matter how great you think your sex life is, if you ever have sex while taking LSD, your normal sex life would be like making love to a department store mannequin. And so, of course, this got enormous attention.
And looking at the statements that he's been making over a period of time, as late as a month or so ago, it indicates quite clearly that he was promoting the use of LSD and promoting it in a way that it wasn't going to be supervised, and in my judgment, endangering the lives of many of our citizens and particularly many of our young people.
When a Harvard professor began to preach this and to urge the youth of America to take LSD, this suddenly seemed like a huge cultural crisis.
The first Flintstones episode aired during prime time on the 30th of September, 1960.
Cat? You ever see the Flintstones?
Sure.
Do you think Wilma's sexy?
Wilma Flintstone?
Maybe we've been alone in deep space too long, but every time I see that show, her body drives me crazy. Is it me?
I think, in all probability, Wilma Flintstone is the most desirable woman who ever lived.
That's good. I thought I was going strange.
She's incredible.
What do you think of Betty?
Betty Rubble? Well, I would go with Betty. But I'd be thinking of Wilma.
This is crazy. Why are we talking about going to bed with Wilma Flintstone?
You're right. We're nuts. This is an insane conversation.
She'll never leave Fred, and we know it.
1962 saw the release of Lawrence of Arabia. Quote, "This epic film with a running time of 227 minutes rejects melodrama and standard tropes, instead relying on stunning visuals, an award-winning musical score, and a visionary cinematic style that would influence a host of future directors, including Steven Spielberg. The historical drama is based on the experiences of British Colonel T. E. Lawrence, who served as an advisor to Bedouin forces in their revolt against the Ottomans during World War I. It won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director." End quote. This was a release in color, and you have to see it to fully understand its effect on society.
None of my friends.
Or better yet, see it on acid. In 1962 is when Bob Marley's first single was released in Jamaica, and in 1965 his first album. Also in 1962. Undoubtedly the most significant event of 1962 happened in July, when an American spy plane spotted the presence of Soviet nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba, which led to a standoff, and JFK threatened Russia with war. The United States and the Soviet Union came very close to war, with Fidel Castro urging Russia's President Khrushchev to consider a nuclear first strike against the US. While the US military wanting to bomb Cuba with airstrikes, but the Russian leader eventually turned their ships around back to Russia. In October 1962 the US Navy detected the Russian submarine B-59 and dropped depth charges to force it up to the surface, but the captain of the sub thought that war had begun, so he wanted to launch a nuclear weapon. To launch a nuke, the order had to be agreed upon by 3 of the captains on board, and only one of the 3 voted against it. He eventually persuaded the others to surface and wait for orders from Russia. So it was a very tense period filled with a lot of anxiety. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech during the March on Washington. In 1963, the act of one man set off a chain of events that led to a revolution, the fall of a regime, and even influenced America's involvement in the Vietnam War. The Burning Monk Incident. On the 8th of May, 1963, during the celebration of Gautama Buddha's birthday in Hue, Vietnam, the government sent police to stop Buddhists from waving their religious flags. The police opened fire on the Buddhist celebration, killing 9 people. This act of discrimination sparked outrage among the Buddhists, leading to protests against the Diem regime, which discriminated against them and favored the Catholic minority. On June 11, 1963, in Saigon, South Vietnam, Thich Quang Duc, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, set himself on fire to protest the persecution of Buddhists by the South Vietnamese government led by President Ngo Dinh Diem, a Roman Catholic. His act of sacrifice was captured by photographer Malcolm Brown and became a powerful symbol of resistance and the struggle for freedom. He chose a busy intersection in Saigon as the site of his protest. He sat down in a lotus position, poured gasoline over himself, and lit a match. He remained calm and silent as he burned to death. His fellow monks and nuns chanted prayers and slogans around him. The self-immolation shocked the world and made headlines in newspapers and magazines. President John F. Kennedy said that the photo of the burning monk had generated more emotion than any other news picture in history. He ordered a reassessment of the U.S. support for the Diem regime, which eventually led to a coup that overthrew and killed Diem in November 1963. The U.S. also increased its military involvement in Vietnam, which escalated into a full-scale war. Thich Quang Duc is revered as a martyr and a hero by many Buddhists and Vietnamese. His heart, which survived the fire, is considered a relic and is kept at a pagoda in Ho Chi Minh City. His act of self-immolation has inspired many other protests around the world, such as those by Tibetans, Iranians, and Tunisians. His image has also been used in various cultural and artistic works, such as songs, films, and paintings. But why were the Americans so involved in Vietnam? Another quick history lesson. The Vietnam War in 60 seconds. Firstly, after World War II, many countries had no system of government. The Russians wanted the countries without a government to become communist. America and the Allies wanted those countries to be democratic. Okay. So Vietnam used to belong to France, but by World War II Japan up and took it for itself, and when Japan surrendered after the atom bombs, Viet Minh, a communist-led organization, had taken over a large number of government buildings and declared independence from France, but the French tried to take it back. The Russians assisted the Viet Minh communists and refused to let it be taken by France, so the country was divided into two. Kinda like North and South Korea still is to this day. When the monk burned himself, America intervened and wanted the democratic side to take control, so it sent a whole bunch of troops to the country. The Russians actually provided the communists with financial and military aid, and after a long battle and many dead soldiers, the Americans ended up losing anyway and the communists eventually won. So to this day Vietnam is officially still a communist country. Well, kinda. 1964. The U.S. military orders that 2.2 million American young men be drafted for the war in Vietnam. Now imagine this. You've just started to recover from the fear that you might be blown up by a Russian nuke, then you hear that the government is going to force you to go fight a war in Vietnam. If you were a male between the ages of 18 and 25, you were required to register with the Selective Service System. After you've registered, your name would be part of a large pool of names, then you would be notified when your turn comes around, which could come at any time. If your number was called, you had to report to your local draft board from where you would be shipped to Vietnam. If you failed to register or report for duty, you could be fined or possibly sent to prison. Many young American men volunteered, but not everyone wanted to go to war. Some saw the draft as a death sentence and did not believe in the cause they were supposed to fight for. Many tried to avoid the draft in various ways. Some sought refuge in college, others intentionally failed aptitude tests, thousands fled to Canada, and a growing number just flat out refused. The draft system led to widespread protests. So one day you might be a decent, law-abiding citizen, and the next day you're a criminal because you don't want to be shipped off to go die in a foreign country. In 1964 Australia also enacted a draft for soldiers to send to Vietnam, but from 1966 to 1968 a growing force of conscientious objectors, inspired by America, grew in Australia, and by 1967 became openly popular due to a growing protest movement. 1964, the free speech movement begins at the University of California, Berkeley, with students protesting restrictions on political speech on campus. Also in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The following footage is from 1964. There are two things to note in the footage: the lack of hippies, and then listen and take very careful note of the manner in which the young people speak and the issues they put forth.
I believe the thing that keeps the world going is that people never can achieve anything to its fullest. You know, otherwise, if people could achieve everything, it would have to come to an end. It couldn't go on.
That's right.
You know,
because if you just
I mean, you have to have a goal. You have to have a road, but the road never ends.
a couple of days, I'll find out my something. It takes so long to find out what your something really is. You know, you just keep going and going and going.
Parents, they're afraid to face it. I mean, it's just rotten. The whole generation is completely mashed out. They just don't care.
Not that they lack concern, but they lack enough concern to really look at a problem and figure out what might be an answer, like the Cold War and all.
Is that being square is out. That is to say.
In order for me to exist, I have to exist essentially outside of the system, because the system won't allow me to form.
No matter what its formal structure is.
We have to do a lot of research before we can find out what a different kind of society can be established. But you certainly can't do it from within.
Most children do take part in a lot of these, and as a result, why probably the influence of the parent is somewhat diluted. You just don't. You don't have them under your control for as much as perhaps when I was in high school.
I feel that you take the time even to tell me anything that you're doing during the day to make me feel it all close to you. I can't just see you on Saturday night and Sunday and really feel part of your life.
Well, I just feel that you've got better things to worry about here at home and to worry about the problems that I encounter during the day.
1965, the Selma to Montgomery marches take place, with civil rights activists marching from Selma, Alabama, to the state capitol in Montgomery to demand voting rights for African Americans. 1965 also brought a color television revolution, with NBC broadcasting the vast majority of its primetime programming in color at the start of the 1965 to 1966 season. In 1966, Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted into the military owing to his religious beliefs and ethical opposition to the Vietnam War, and was found guilty of draft evasion and stripped of his boxing titles. The government wanted to make an example out of him and wanted to lock him up, but he stayed out of prison while appealing the decision to the Supreme Court. Ali's actions as a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War made him an icon for the larger counterculture of the 1960s generation, and he was a very high-profile figure of racial pride for African Americans. That same year, 1966, protests against the Vietnam War began to escalate, with students across the country organizing teach-ins and demonstrations. LSD is declared illegal in America in 1966, with old people stating that it would lead to a collapse of society. 1967, The Human Being was a cultural event that took place on January 14, 1967, in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park polo fields. It was aimed at bringing together all of the different counterculture movements of the time to unite against the government's clampdown on LSD and shrooms. It is rumored that Owsley parachuted down from a plane to the event to hand out 30,000 doses of LSD. But he later denied this. I mean, of course he would, because he was being monitored by the CIA and the FBI during this time. It was a prelude to the Summer of Love, which made the Haight-Ashbury district a symbol of American counterculture and introduced the word psychedelic to suburbia. The event drew more than 20,000 people and featured speakers like Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, Allen Ginsberg, and Jerry Rubin, as well as music from local rock bands like Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, and Big Brother, and the Holding Company. The Human Being focused on key ideas of the 1960s counterculture, including personal empowerment, cultural and political decentralization, communal living, ecological awareness, higher consciousness with the aid of psychedelic drugs, acceptance of illicit psychedelics use, and radical new left political consciousness. 1967, the Summer of Love, was a social phenomenon that occurred. Most of the historical hippie footage is from this era. To emphasize just how crazy this event was, you can't really call it an event at this season. San Francisco at this time was overflowing with hippies. People were tripping on acid all over, just thousands of hippies as far as you could see. People were making love just out in the open and drugs were free. Wait? What? Did you say free? Yes, free drugs everywhere you looked. There's one report of a helicopter flying over and just dropping pages of acid everywhere. If you didn't know, LSD is produced on a sheet of paper, which is made up of like 200 to 300 little squares. Each one of those is a full dose. And that was dropping out of the air for free while artists just got up and started performing for the masses of crowds.
It was the largest migration of young people in the history of America. From every direction they came. From the biggest cities and from the smallest towns. All bound for San Francisco in the summer of 1967.
100,000 is a minimum estimate of what's happening. I think it's be a major historical event for this country.
We are trying to do what no one else has ever done before in this culture, and that is to find a new way for humanity.
Minds are up for grabs. It's up for grabs. Civilization's up for grabs. I think everybody knows it.
Drawn by the city's new hippie counterculture, with its vision of changing the world through peace and love, they arrived in numbers great enough to create a crisis in San Francisco, threatening the utopian dream itself.
Tons of hippies. I remember when we were young we were always being warned not to accept drugs from strangers, right? But no one offered us any drugs in 1967. Everyone was offering you drugs. As many as you'd like. No catch and not like drug dealers today. The strategy is give you the first one free. To get you hooked. Then charge a whole lot. No, not like that because LSD is not addictive. So it was really 100% free. And it was completely legal. It's probably why I love hippie culture so much. If you were there, everyone just genuinely cared about you. No matter who you are, what you looked like, you were loved. Without any strings attached. If you watch a documentary on the Summer of Love, there's this bit where Joni sings. It just always gets to me. It feels so real and I get so emotional wishing I could have seen it, the Summer of Love. Now, remember in episode 1, I went through the list of what trauma symptoms manifest as. Just to name a few, sudden and extreme changes in behavior. Avoiding being placed on the spot. Being a people pleaser, in other words wanting to take care of everyone, making sure they get what they need. Judging people to be either all good or all bad. Hippies saw everyone as good, as someone they could trust, which led to some of them being taken advantage of in terrible ways, but overall their Summer of Love was a success, letting the world know that the hippie movement was a massive cultural revolution. Now this is just my own opinion based on my own experience, but I think trauma shaped a lot of what was happening in the 60s. World War II left the whole world desperately wanting peace. And I think a lot of hippies were personally traumatized either by the reality of what family life was like back then, living with parents who were strict, emotionally unavailable, emotionally and physically abusive, racist, money hungry, then also by the events that transpired in the 50s and 60s, and to top it off, the government trying to force young people to fight a war they did not believe in. And if you were ever a troubled teen, then you know the powerful influence of music. If you were feeling down and you played some Cranberries, Alanis Morissette, Smashing Pumpkins, Cypress Hill, or Bohemian Rhapsody, I don't know what music young people have today. But you get what I'm saying. It's like the music was made just for you, that music speaks to you on a level that's personal, deep, and now back then that's what the Beatles' music did for young people. Only recently I've listened to some Grateful Dead and I was shocked to hear early versions of songs that totally sucked in the 80s, remakes. And of course, Joni, which is currently my all-time favorite. And if you take LSD, it changes you. Not just changes your outlook on life. It changes your brain physically, but I'll get to that in the next video. Until then, peace.
We were all getting high together.
Well, you'd often meet somebody and have sex with them and never see them again. And it was not an exploitative thing. It was like falling in love for 3 hours and okay, bye.
One day I walked down to Haight Street and I saw a shop down there called the Psychedelic Shop. I said, this is getting pretty interesting.
Try to set the night on fire.
The Psychedelic Shop was run by the Thielen brothers, Ron and Jay, hippies who believed deeply in the counterculture.
I think San Francisco is the holy city. I think it's going to be the Mecca of the West. And what I'm going to propose in January, although I don't know about the ethical propriety of it, is that Allen Ginsberg run for mayor of San Francisco.
Their shop was a haven for the flower children and visitors like LSD guru Timothy Leary.
Prosperity that it was possible to live a very, inexpensive existence without, having to spend all your time scrambling. You didn't have to work a job all the time.
It felt like family, so that people you'd never met before felt like your brother or your sister. And if you had a meal, you shared it.
In those days in the Haight-Ashbury, nobody locked their house. Nobody locked their front door. It was a very sweet neighborhood.
We were community outreach to make a new community.
Ginny Goldhaft, along with husband Peter Berg and a group of actors, including Peter Coyote and Emmett Grogan, formed the Diggers in 1966 with the intention of upending the dynamics of capitalism. They provided free food, free housing, opened a free store and a free medical clinic.
If we provided the basic human necessities, then people didn't have to go downtown, put on a white shirt and a suit, become the man in the gray flannel suit. They could actually live their life and explore what would be the most beautiful life they could lead.
They also performed street theater and organized free concerts, which began showcasing the rise of a new sound.
Before the Summer of Love, the Haight-Ashbury was the center of this incredible new music that was coming out of San Francisco, and specifically coming out of the Haight. Jefferson Airplane, Grace Slick, Janis Joplin, Big Brother and the Holding Company. Fantastic music that was visionary and was completely connected to this idea of a total change of consciousness.
It was music aligned with the psychedelia of LSD.
Colors seemed brighter, trees seemed to be breathing.
Mimicking these sensations, acid or psychedelic rock, as it would become known, broke with many conventions. Songs were heavily distorted, often long and improvised.
Psychedelic rock took music to a completely different place, away from love songs and much more towards songs about big existential issues, about freedom and about profound personal change.
And of all the genres soon to be stars, none epitomized that more than a group named the Grateful Dead. They were Haight-Ashbury mainstays, led by singer-songwriter Jerry Garcia.
Jerry Garcia was a very bright guy. What he and the Grateful Dead tried to do was to, create something different. They didn't have any wild expectations that they were going to change all the world, tomorrow. But they started with themselves and tried to create a better way of life.
This is the house of a popular local band which plays hard rock music. They call themselves the Grateful Dead. They live together comfortably in what could be called affluence.
what we're thinking about is a peaceful planet. We're not thinking about anything else. We're not thinking about any kind of power. We're not thinking about any of those kind of struggles. We're not thinking about revolution or war or any of that. That's not what we want. Nobody wants to get hurt. Nobody wants to hurt anybody. We would all like to be able to live an uncluttered life.
Because the movement was divided between the cultural revolutionaries and the politicos. So the human being was an attempt to get the politicos and the cultural revolutionaries or hippies to all get together and unite. Held on January 14th, 1967 in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, the Be-In drew tens of thousands.
Perhaps there were 1,000 people in the Haight-Ashbury. And somewhere north of 40,000 people showed up in Golden Gate Park. They all looked around and went, God, there's a lot of us here.
Among them was Timothy Leary, who stood before the crowd and famously proclaimed, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," to explain that he was trying to get at something much deeper than just drop out of society. He meant drop out of conventional reality, drop out of the mainstream, turn on using LSD and marijuana and tune in to a deeper consciousness and a more profound connectiveness of peace and love with your fellow being.
The festival would also introduce American audiences to two future icons of 1960s music, The Who, and an electric guitar maestro named Jimi Hendrix.
Hendrix stole the show with his theatrics, but he was mind-bogglingly brilliant too. I mean, it wasn't just show.